Hello, everyone. Good day, dear friends and colleagues. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 10th online lecture of Peking Temporal Lecture Series on Organization and Management in Higher Education. Today, we have the privilege of hosting Professor Elias Karayiannis, who will deliver a talk on higher education institutions' efficiency and higher order learning theories, policies, and practices. Dr. Elias Karayiannis, Professor of Science, Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship at George Washington University. He is a co-founder and co-director of Global and Entrepreneurial Finance Research Institute and the director of the European Union Research Center. Professor Karayiannis specializes in strategic R&D partnership, technology transfer, international science and technology policy, and technological entrepreneurship and regional economic development. He has published extensively with over 60 books and numerous articles in prestigious peer-reviewed journals. Additionally, Professor Karayiannis is the founding editor-in-chief of multiple book series and 2 Springer journals, Journal of the Knowledge Economy and the Journal of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Dr. Karayiannis is also a sought-after consultant for technology-driven organizations in both government and private sector, including the World Bank and the European Commission. He's also multilingual and fluent in English, French, German, Greek, also with a working knowledge of Spanish. During today's lecture, Professor Karayiannis will provide valuable insight into the efficacy of higher education institutions and the concept of higher order learning. Professor Karayiannis is renowned, as you know, for the development of a quadruple helix model of innovation and the quintuple helix innovation in collaboration with David Campbell. His lecture today promises to be highly informative, drawing on his extensive research on the relations between higher education and society. This presentation will greatly contribute to our comprehensive understanding of the evolving landscape of higher education and its impacts on the universities and colleges. Such knowledge with emphasis on the outside-in perspective on higher education will aid us in addressing the governance challenges faced by higher education institutions. So thank you, Elias, and now I give the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yuzo, and I thank the Center for the opportunity to join and engage, and I appreciate people's time. I realize there's a holiday period still in China for those there currently. I'm glad to connect and actually offer future interactions and continuations. It has been a pleasure to be affiliated and connected with Professor Kai through numerous projects and ongoing research efforts, including the Journal of the Knowledge Economy that he mentioned, also the Triple Helix Journal that he edits. I will talk about a number of things today. We have limited time, and this is, in some sense, a work in progress. So I apologize if I end up going too fast over certain things. We can always, as I said, I'm open to further discussions and interactions going forward. This indeed is about understanding, or trying to anyway, get a better sense of what the university, what the missions of the university are. Talk about the first, second, third mission, and how can they take place in a manner that is more effective and efficient. This is the issue of efficacy. And the business of a university pivots around learning in the end, right? So higher order learning, or in other words, ways that you can enhance your learning and also further enhance the ways you enhance your learning. So first, second, and third order learning are very important in that regard. They're about the efficacy per se of the university and its value added, so to speak, products and services. Now, I'm currently, as was indicated, professor at the George Washington University. Have been there for more than 25 years, but I'm also involved and collaborating as visiting faculty in many universities in Europe. So indeed, I will provide a multilateral perspective, hopefully, on this, and that will also resonate with people, colleagues, and interested parties in China and other countries in Asia. The agenda, which I have shared along with a long list of references grouped in a manner that will be helpful, can be shown here. Let me see if I can enlarge this a little bit. I don't know if I can do this. I can't do this in presentation mode, but hopefully you can do it on your screens. There are theories, policies, and then practices and discussion themes I will touch on as the time allows. Of course, the higher order learning theme is at the forefront. In fact, my doctoral thesis in the mid-90s actually was focused on that, and I'll have some comments and concepts about the research that originated there. The thesis in my first book was entitled The Strategic Management of Technological Learning. So how do you manage learning that actually obviously is at least partly based on and driven by technology in a manner that allows you to better position yourself, whether you are a for-profit entity, a company, or in this instance, a university. And so this is the challenge and the opportunity. Can we, in a sense, can universities and all of us as academics better understand, adapt, and leverage technology and other trends to adjust our institutional contexts and regulatory and protocol setups, so to speak, as to how we operate, including the structure of the universities, the vertical typically structure where you have disciplines and departments and schools and universities, and consider a different approach that I'll discuss. What I call here the fractal research, education, and innovation ecosystem approach. Now, Professor Kai mentioned the quadruple and the quintuple innovation helix frameworks that effectively are a continuation or an enhancement, I believe, and a significant departure from the original triple helix concept. All helical concepts in the socio-technical sense that we're looking at here are, of course, inspired by the double helix of nature, biology. The idea is that the helical structure, the helical architecture, is actually providing a very highly effective and efficient way to interface, to have exchange of knowledge, data, information, and knowledge, and to be in that sense as effective and efficient as possible. So if and the more we move in that direction, away from vertical structures and disconnects, and more towards what I would call strategic fragmentation, integration, and away from tactical fragmentation because of agendas, turfs, priorities, cultural issues, and what have you. We know well how academics operate. The better we will be to be more effective and efficient. And in fact, the better we serve both society and the economy. And there are some points at the end, some cases that we'll touch on, including, and this is a culmination of many of the concepts that we will try to touch on today, as I said briefly, is the idea of a toolkit, organized methodologies and tools that actually can help this cultural, institutional, and also technological transformation. Within that discussion, we'll talk about, of course, digital transformation, industry 4.0, but then also where we're headed towards, where we should be aiming for industry 5.0 and society 5.0 to begin with, which is a more balanced, human-centric and technocentric approach. After all, universities are about, or should about people, should about improving and enhancing the human condition, the human mind, and advancing in that sense civilization. Let me just continue with a brief comment from a quote from Einstein about imagination versus knowledge, which is also very, very important. And that relates to what I like to define as thinking beyond the box, not just outside the box, to differentiate thinking inside the box. They're all important. We have rules, facts, figures, data, processes that we need to follow. We can't just ignore the guidelines, but at the same time, we should move beyond that. We always have the past, the knowledge, the experience, and the habits that are acting as in a way constraints to our imagination, to our problem redefinition, reinvention, to lead to better problem solutions. So if we, or the more we try to exercise this thinking beyond the box practice, it's like a Zen practice, it's ongoing, you continually try to improve it lifelong. And this is also related to the lifelong learning, of course, issue, then the better we all will be. A brief comment about what we're dealing with nowadays. We all know what's going on around the world, and a lot of divides, social, political, economic, cultural, knowledge, and digital. There is opportunities and challenges in this regard. I would like to think of and hope for a better tomorrow where wisdom prevails and fear is suppressed. And universities, in fact, building awareness, understanding, and intellectual as well as cultural and socio-economic proximity and prosperity can be a very important enabler of this better tomorrow. And of course, Europe has its own very specific challenges. As it tries to become more integrated, it also needs to balance basic freedoms at the citizen level within the European democracies, and also the institutional and regulatory priorities of federalism as it is emerging and maturing. That in itself is, of course, happening in the bigger global context of large countries having their own voice and increasingly so their own influence. So Europe, and that also relates to the universities, European universities in particular could play a very important bridging device role for promoting, as I said, wiser, more prosperity and peaceful coexistence modes of operating and thinking, first of all. And this is what about research and knowledge is. So here is the bigger vision that I have over some time ago now developed in a book that I published in 2005 called Smart Development. The idea of whether and how we could move from our natural scarcity towards artificial abundance. Technology, but also the universities as engines of growth, innovation, and development are tremendous catalysts, triggers, catalysts, and accelerators, enablers of this. And we've seen that become increasingly pronounced and influential as technology has become preeminent in the context of artificial intelligence, for that matter. We have both tremendous opportunities and also challenges, as we know well, including having ChatGPT possibly replace us. And we have our avatars interacting with each other, but let's not discuss that at this point. but this is an open issue. So then, going back in time a little bit, we have basic inputs to economic activity. We'll talk about innovation as well briefly, but land, labor, capital, basic inputs to activity that economies engaged in have for centuries was complemented and in fact greatly transformed by technology, entrepreneurship, and knowledge. And these are important ingredients also of the modern academia, the modern university. I will relate to the concepts of the academic firm and the entrepreneurial university as part of this discussion, because they are indeed interesting, helpful models to consider in connecting the university with the rest of the society and the economy, and in the context of the quintuple innovation helix: government, university, industry, civil society, and the environment, connecting the university, as we will see, with both the government, stakeholders and institutions, but also, of course, industry, the private sector, and society. We'll talk about a civic concept, a civic dimension of the entrepreneurial university. And as far as I'm concerned, at least, when we talk about entrepreneurial university, it does not connote automatically in the narrow sense only the profit maximization priority. There are a lot of public funding resources or publicly sourced resources and assets provided to universities worldwide. And in effect, what the universities do should have a hybrid nature, should be both public and private good. The educational solutions, but also if you have technologies that are being developed and licensed or spun off in the form of companies, there should always be a public aspect or dimension to this as a public good, not just a private profit maximizing consideration. You need some kind of harmony between the two to ensure that you have successful solutions and proper incentives and behaviors, but you do not want to ignore the public aspect of this. Then as far as efficacy, effective efficiency, perhaps you could look at it, it's about effectiveness and efficiency. And there are different models you can have to consider how that is manifested, measured, and so forth. But as we will see, and that certainly applies, and it's related to a lot of research we have been doing on analyzing, mapping, and designing more effective and efficient innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems. So effectively, in essence, what we're talking about here is the different ways you can get things done, to do the right thing or to do things right, or both. And this is really capturing another picture is capturing the essence of this. So this is about doing the right things right in the first instance. This should be the objective. Of course, in many cases, you're just doing things. That applies, unfortunately, to universities too, where there is also often tremendous institutional inertia and the tactical fragmentations I mentioned, and possibly also governmental or public sector behavior and roles that may pay lip service to reform incentives and encouragements, but does not really want to see that, because truly effective and efficient universities can become increasingly autonomous universities. We see that in many countries. This is not a matter of how democratic, let's say, or transparent a regime is. It's about the sort of the power play between the academics and the public sector. The academics do control the means of production as far as knowledge generation goes. And since we're increasingly becoming knowledge-driven, not just knowledge-based societies and economies, that means that the academics have increasing power that they don't even realize they have, as well as responsibility, of course. And so there is this issue there that is Faustian in nature. How do you trade off between power, responsibility, autonomy, and control? in the end, ideally, you can afford to just keep doing things. You have to at least try to do things right. But even then, you may end up dying quickly, as you see. Try to do more, doing the right things that will allow you to survive. But ideally, you want to thrive, which means to do the right things right. Okay. Now, I can hear some back echo. If someone has their microphone on or is getting some echo in that sense, please control that if you can. So here's briefly, actually, my first book, 20 plus. It appeared in 2000. It almost could be from the last century. So hopefully I avoided that kind of antiquity effect, but I believe there is some remaining residual relevance and validity in the things I captured there, based primarily on my doctoral thesis. And I'll go quickly some of the schematics, the conceptual representation that were the building blocks of both my thesis and many publications that followed up later. In fact, I must say that over the years, I have been pleasantly surprised to experience a lot of interest from various scholars in different countries, especially in China, about this work. First of all, we look at a mapping, so to speak, of different styles of decision making that at the time and still reflected the emphasis on more rigid procedural approaches or more open-ended learning-enabled approaches. The culmination of those being, as you see here, the metacognitive paradigm and this school of thought, so to speak, that I framed, called strategic or active incrementalism. The idea is that you're almost agnostic. You try to have very clear, of course, tenets and precepts, frames of reference, assumptions you operate with, but you try to also be very open to environmental change, to be scanning, to have situational awareness, as we say, and have 360 degrees awareness and enable and drive your activities and your interactions with the environment, both the local, the endogenous, as well as the exogenous, the institutional, as well as the natural, in ways that are enabled by higher order learning. And we'll talk about that next. So the idea, of course, is to develop the proper algorithm, so to speak, that will guide you. And so this is about strategy. In my definition of strategy, there are many different ways, and I will not presume to know what would make sense or what would be better. But my definition I would like to offer is that strategy, if you think about it this way, is to discern the non-obvious, to identify what is non-obvious, and obviously it is important. Faster, better, cheaper, longer. And that is now AI enabled. Now, if you go back to Sun Tzu, your ancient Chinese philosopher, and his work, among others, his work on the art of war, there is some relevance there in what I just said. And this is, well, since I mentioned power play, and of course, game theoretic context, we don't have time to look into that more specifically today. This is also part of our considerations, research, and efforts. Game theoretic contexts are very much applicable to academic, both discourse and academic governance, which is one of the things we look at. And again, continuing, I want to go faster now. Schools of thought, of course, the Austrian school of thought at the bottom right is the one where you have the highest emphasis on learning and also the focus on strategy making. This is what was the pivot, so to speak, both for my doctoral research at the time, where I try to find out in different contexts, in different sectors. I looked at, and I apologize for giving you some context for that already, but my thesis was a series of ethnographic studies, semi-structured interviews, and the long-term longitudinal immersion in organizations in 4 different countries and 5 sectors. And I literally physically visited places and companies and people. The US, Canada, Germany, and France. I looked at software engineering, software production, pharmaceutical, transportation, advanced materials, and nuclear power. I wanted to see in a sector where there should be no room for failure or error, and very high regulation, nuclear power, vis-a-vis sectors that are very competitive, very high rivalry, such as pharmaceuticals, software, but also transportation. Companies like Airbus, Daimler, but also Saint-Gobain in the advanced material sector, and of course, Bayer and others in pharmaceuticals and so forth, were involved in this study. And the point was that I wanted to find out what made these companies, what was their real source of sustainable competitive advantage and superior, not just sustainable competitive advantage. And higher order learning emerged repeatedly, consistently, and people actually, in many cases, were surprised to realize that this was what it was about, and that therefore training and development internally, but also education and lifelong learning and open-minded thinking, as I said before, beyond the box approaches would be critical to redefine themselves over time and leapfrog the competition and so forth. And so this was a very interesting experience for me, tremendous learning opportunity. And one more point, I found a lot more wisdom in the front lines than in the top line, meaning, and after all these years, I can safely perhaps say explicitly, there was a major process of reform and transformation in the energy sector at the time, in particular nuclear power energy. And I was being given a lot of sort of standard lines, lip service by the CEOs. I had the fortune as a student at a university in New York to actually email directly people, or fax at the time people, and they would respond. The managing directors or CEOs even of companies in Europe and in the US. So the CEOs were telling me one thing, the frontline people, engineers and others were telling me another, which turned out to be much more accurate and consistent with what happened. So I don't want to say that people were deceiving me intentionally. They may well have been at the top, hostages of their own bubble, which is a very serious, important, significant, and even dangerous lesson if ignored for people at the top, including at the universities. Let me continue. And this is also about a culture of learning. And about the culture, the top, the iceberg, I guess, analogy, artifacts, values, basic assumptions, things that are more obvious and less obvious. Often the less obvious things matter most. Now, triple loop learning, Chris Argyris, as I call him, or Argyris, is Greek, professor at Harvard University, and others developed this idea of Deftero learning, as he called it, which is really about learning to learn. And then also this idea, Shine and others developed this idea about triple loop learning. I enhanced, developed, and validated that in my doctoral thesis. You see here what this is about, and this is directly applicable still today in my mind in the academic sector. And when we talk about high efficacy, as I call the title of this discussion, higher educational institutions efficacy, and I made a pun here in case people missed it, an old movie, a comedy, I guess, with Mel Brooks. The title was High Anxiety. There's a lot of anxiety in academia nowadays, and for good reason. And so high efficacy sort of tries to echo the high anxiety parallel. Anyway, embedded social traditions, governing values, actions, and outcomes. There are loops connecting all those. And as you'll see also with the work there's one slide that captures my entire thesis later on. This is about the presence and significance of feed-forward and feedback loops. We don't learn in a vacuum. As we learn, we are impacted and we impact our environment as well. I mean, this is almost going back to physics and the concept that at the subatomic level, as you make observations, the observation itself is a disturbance that changes what you're observing. That may also relate to the uncertainty principle. I will not go into physics now. The point being here is that we have an environment that has aspects that are time transcending. They are time insensitive. They change much slower, if at all, with time. And then, of course, we have the time domain. We need to be mindful of both, and they are fitting into each other and off each other. So this is what I'm trying to denote here with this map, sort of the mental map of data, information, knowledge, and then beyond that, intelligence, wisdom, values, myth, consciousness. And the idea is that we, as academics, should be in the business of not just focusing on data, information, and even knowledge, but we should really look beyond that. And it's about imparting, hopefully, and shaping and improving wisdom, as I said in the beginning. So this, and that means longer term perspectives, broader landscapes, transdisciplinarity. We'll talk about that if time allows, but this is about getting beyond the verticals of disciplines and having a broader view. So we have also the analytic, cybernetic, and cognitive paradigms. And the reason I post those as far as decision-making goes is that their intersection is this metacognitive paradigm of self-organizing learning, which was the focus of my research and remains so. Now, Herb Simon, the Nobel laureate, developed, of course, the satisficing model of decision-making that you see on the left. My strategic incrementalist model, of course, was inspired by that, by added a lot of nonlinearity and loops, basically, the feedback and feed-forward loops I mentioned before, and the different levels of learning, as we call them, operational, tactical, and strategic. There is experience, escalation, and of course, integration as we go forward. And here is the slide that captures my doctoral thesis and is the foundation of a lot of the research that followed. The triple layer architecture of technological learning. Interestingly, let me mention that anecdote as well. I have both. I have engineering and advanced engineering studies degrees, and also, of course, then in management. And in the 80s, I was seriously interested in automation and robotics. In fact, the companies were trying to hire me and others even before we would graduate. Now, what happened? I had done a lot of work. In fact, my focus was on stereoscopic vision, pattern recognition, and object identification, and other such things, and related algorithms. Really focusing on early artificial intelligence. Many of the things that are now very much in fashion. That sounds almost arcane to me, strange, because I'm familiar with concepts such as deep learning and so forth for quite some time now. Of course, technology now has allowed us, as always is the case, to move beyond the concept into full-fledged implementations and the AI modalities. But the point is that at the time, this work had a dual nature, and I made a conscious choice not to go into an area of application that would increasingly sort of force me to embed in a process of research and development for what was at the time called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or the Star Wars. Okay, because if you have stereo vision, you can work in automation in manufacturing, but you can also do that for other things. And I took a lot of these ideas that I had developed in my research on artificial intelligence and intelligent controls in automation and robotics and applied them to the human condition, to organizations. So this is what you see here to some extent. And so I haven't regretted doing that actually, because I have been freer to do what I like rather than follow certain guidelines. So here is the point of learning and the different modes of learning, and just briefly over those things for reference. Robustness, variety, and redundancy apply to different levels. You want all of those. And if you think about what's happening nowadays in artificial intelligence and data curation and data validation and interpretation of results, and then on the other end, the development of the capacity to be predictive, preventive, preemptive, and so forth. This is actually related to things that can apply, for instance, to cyber security. In fact, we have Best Paper Award for 2021 for the IEEE Transactions in Engineering Management was for a paper I did with colleagues called Ambidextrous Cybersecurity, the 7 pillars of cyber resilience. And these are 7 words starting with P that relate to both mindset as well as behavior, and of course are enabled by technology. And that is being patient, proactive, perseverant, and persistent, but also predictive, preventive, preemptive. Well, if you think about it, that's a lot to do. That has a lot to do with the concepts we're discussing here. And what this complex, busy slide is about, it's really the whole algorithmic conceptual architecture of how you accumulate data, information, knowledge, and develop your intelligence about where you are and what's happening around you. And in effect, establish the capacity to identify, remember I said predict, prevent, preempt, develop the capacity to identify when you get to a point of a critical mass transformation or change in the technology innovation context and technology life cycle concept. You have points of disruption. This is about setting up some parameters so that you can establish a methodology to anticipate to some extent disruption. Try to at least be able to know when you may have when you get a point where you have this shifting of the apex of the pyramid here, and we call that in a sense a manifestation of that could be, for instance, the business model innovation nowadays terminology. You reinvent yourself. You need to figure out where to go next and how to do things differently, because things have been brewing and accumulating. And this now shows how all of this come together in terms of different assets, intangible assets, knowledge assets, from basic knowledge that or data, information, and knowledge that relate to your basic processes, to the top of the pyramid or the cone here that actually relates to or is the product of higher order learning, and it is very much time sensitive and context sensitive. So that actually can be both very valuable and very transient. Now, universities are not companies or even governments. They do not operate at the speed of data, information, and knowledge. They like to have their own more, I guess, dignified rhythm, but in some regards, they may need to learn how to expedite and figure out a way to balance speed with grace. Speed with grace. I think this is a nice description of successful universities that have more or have sufficient degrees of harmony internally. Now, operational, tactical, and strategic types of learning are where you have a collection of data, facts, figures at the basic level. Operational is what I call it. And then tactical is where you have learning how to learn. And I showed the schematic before. You organize what you have and figure out whether you need to ask different questions. Okay. And at the strategic level, you redefine what you mean with a question. This is thinking beyond the box. You really say, okay, this is what I see, but what is it I don't? And again, going back several years, I have published a piece on managerial and organizational cognition, and I talk about the cognition, the enlightenment spiral of cognition, where this is a succession of cycles you go through. Each cycle being, transcending, being a journey from a point of where you don't know anything, you have ignorance of ignorance, to a point of awareness of ignorance. You start formulating questions to then finding answers. You have awareness of awareness to then internalizing that knowledge to practice. And I have references to Michael Polanyi and others about tacit knowledge. So as you internalize, the knowledge becomes tacit. All of that tacit and explicit knowledge accumulates, develops critical mass to go to the next level. And then, so the point is, we need to figure out how that whole phenomenon or whole activity takes place, and you have multiple dimensions and metrics. So it's a multi-criteria process and multifactorial process, where you have content, process, context, and impact dimensions and aspects, both quantitative and qualitative, you need to take into account and try to figure out. And this is research that was done to focus on for-profit entities, but that certainly is applicable to universities as well, not-for-profit entities, because there are important gauges, metrics of performance, key performance indicators there as well. And it should not be that they should be for-loss entities anyway, not-for-profit entities. So figuring out how to become more effective and efficient in this way could be gauged using different metrics. You see some examples here in terms of the content, the process, the context, and the impact. And these are indeed about the different kinds of activities, both tangible and intangible, and related both to learning as well as the content, the context, and the effects of that. Short, medium, and long-term effects. In fact, in the research we did that was longitudinal in two sectors at the time, semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, we found that there is a lag effect. In other words, as you invest in learning, and this is not surprising, but it is important to get some quantitative definition of what the lag is, how long the delay is, and what are the related quantitative aspects of inputs and outputs in that sense. When do you start seeing the benefits of investing in training and development, education, what have you, on the competitive advantage of a company? And how do they manifest, and what are the what is the leverage effect? I mean, for a unit, so to speak, or for a unit of resource allocated or dedicated to training and development or education, what is the multiplier effect? Okay, so all of these things was trying to quantify basically what started with a doctoral thesis as a conceptualization of the field. And again, we did find results that would be useful, not only for companies, but also potentially for universities as well. And of course, there's been a lot of work since in that field. So there is learning that is technical in a narrow sense, and administrative in the broader sense that is both relevant in this regard. And we used at the time content analysis. We used terms to look for frequencies of occurrence of certain things to identify what really was more influential versus others. A lot more sophisticated tools are available nowadays. And here's briefly what the results show. The vertical is return on assets. and the nonlinear nature of this, and the indication that there is a lag was very interesting findings. Happy to further discuss later on or follow up. Nonlinearity and complexity are very important dimensions, and there's different theories, including chaos theory, that is related to this, and even the catastrophe theory from mathematics, mapping into different spaces. When we talk about disruption, this is a very interesting way to potentially understand how you could navigate, or what the likely scenario or surfaces you might find yourself on may be. Now, we'll come back to this more sort of specific context. First of all, a little bit about knowledge versus competencies versus skills. We have, as I said, tacit, we have from the spectrum of codified to tacit knowledge, and knowledge that is independent of observers versus knowledge that is in interaction influenced by observers. I talked about in fact, the subatomic quantum mechanical context example. Competences is really what has the impact, what is manifested, the capacity to provide a solution. And so that means that accumulates, that is we build towards that through training, education, experience, and expertise. And you see that competencies are high in tacit knowledge and knowledge that is interactive. And of course, there is an overlap, and the know-how is the bridge helping us transform data, information, and knowledge into competencies. Really at the heart of what education could or should be about, of course. And again, as I said in the beginning, I'll have to go relatively quickly through some of these slides, but this is stuff also that is in the references, and I'll be happy to share it. Skills, the ability to get certain things done. This is OECD definition, and that defines effectively our parameters or dimensions, attributes of reference for defining educational policies and practices in the end. And then, of course, competences between, written different ways. This is a play with words to some extent, but this is about, in the end, about enhancing how we get things done and enhancing the ability to develop meta skills, as you see here. And this is about learning, higher order learning, as we've mentioned already. So there is dimensions that are related to delivery, interpersonal, and strategic aspects of competencies and their development. This is again from the OECD, and what that tries to show or provide a guideline for how to structure our educational programs. And then the subject, the object, and the organization for development of future skills. That has increasingly become of interest and relevance with the AI, so to speak, advent and disruption, and the questions about the future of work and the future of education, the future of everything in many ways. And this is so a way to try and understand where we are and where we're headed. Interestingly enough, having higher order learning capabilities prepares us for high levels of risk and uncertainty anyway, makes us more adaptive and resilient. This is about the importance of entrepreneurial competencies. Well, what that means here really is about figuring out how to do the best you can within changing frameworks and in contexts that actually may reflect very different circumstances for what you were trained for. We talk about the fog of war, we have the fog of the market, also applicable, and of course, the fog of academia in this context. The lack of clarity and the in high level, high degree of change, high speed and acceleration of change for that matter. And so continuing with this, let me just jump a little bit. This is regarding how meta competencies, the capacity to develop competencies to have lifelong learning apply to secondary, but also tertiary education. And some interesting comments here, developing emotional self-regulation, connecting skills of the past with skills of the future, combining hard and soft skills. Well, this is really project-centric, experiential, driven, and in fact, peer mentored learning. Many of these things are already undertaken in countries like Finland, and I think that highlights the importance of these kinds of practices and policies. In addition, future teachers for lifelong learning, developing a capacity to continually evolve and have an increasingly autonomous even capability to adjust, not just waiting for some new standards to emerge. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is about power play too. You can't have it all ways, meaning both ways or any other ways. You have to trade off. And in the game theoretic sense, it is interesting to reflect and realize the importance of what remains a very important point of reference here, which is the Nash equilibrium. John Nash, effectively intelligent compromise, I would call it, to try to achieve and maintain win-win-win configurations. And this is unfortunately not always obvious or even desirable. What is artificial is very clear. What is intelligence, not so. Well, there's, excuse me, and allow me to say that, along with artificial intelligence, there is natural stupidity. And we have to cope and figure out how to best understand and regulate both. Now, talking about how to regulate and how to deal with challenges and opportunities, governance and epistemic governance for that matter, regarding universities is of relevance. This is a book I did with David Campbell. And it really connects the different knowledge paradigms, things we've been discussing already, with implications for epistemic governance, how you set governance in higher education institutions so that you do the right things right. You have high degrees, levels of effectiveness and efficiency, efficacy, and in the end, you have quality assurance. Now, what is interesting here is that what often implicitly is opposed or considered an impossibility, which was established to be the case years ago with total quality management and the lean movement in manufacturing and what have you, which is that quality actually investing in this context in quality actually ends up costing less. You achieve savings that are much more than the investments you make, and that applies in our context as well. And that relates also to how we engage in digital transformation in the educational sector. In my mind, trying to go cheap on if you have the resources, of course, in redefining and reinventing how you educate. And that has to do with the tools and the modalities, but also has to do with what these tools and modalities can do. The more the advanced, the high spectrum modalities can actually allow increased immersive presence, as we would call it, virtual interactivity that is increasingly multi-dimensional, rich media enabled, that actually makes the physical co-presence less and less needed. Now, universities in general, if you think about it, are convening devices or schemes. They exist, they operate, they have been for centuries, on the assumption, since people would go to the monastery to worship or to be protected or hopefully to learn something, and that's where the university started at, right? As monasteries of some religion or other. Well, that has actually relied on physical co-presence, coexistence, And having this virtualization option becoming increasingly feasible and ironically desirable. Certainly, I have experienced that with people who are especially advanced studies professional people. They rather not undertake the extra cost of movement, even if it is not a major mobility issue, distance issue. And the flexibility of recording and asynchronously engaging and interacting as well as synchronously. So, but the administrators, of course, are concerned. They're worried, understandably, because we will increasingly move, and I want to go to that, to a model of governance that this is what I call fractal research education innovation ecosystem. Freie in German means free. That actually allows people to, the scholars, as was the case in the early years, in the antiquity even, and even through the Middle Ages, scholars would develop their own communities of interest and practice and informally connect without necessarily only going through the official monasteries or other schemes of higher learning. So I'm not saying abolish the universities, but really everybody needs to realize how there is a serious and real need for transformation and reinvention. So the underlying understandings must be explicitly addressed for what type of research, innovation, quality culture we need to aim for, and therefore what policies, practices, and guidelines we need to engage. Very quickly over the some standards, the OECD, different sciences, natural, technical, human, and so forth, and where they all fit. Now these reflect more the vertical thinking, right? So I want to go into the inter and transdisciplinary thinking in a moment. There are things that have increasingly become they go beyond the disciplinary borders, have been, and in fact, in my research, I identified a paradox, which is also a challenge for productivity research, which I call the paradox of converging disciplines and diverging specialization. So you end up having people in life sciences, for instance, having such profound specializations and developing related dialects that sometimes there is the risk of unperceived miscommunication, which could be very dangerous. A more sort of concrete, more obvious example is what happened years ago with NASA, I think, sending a probe to Mars, and it was lost in space because engineers were using both the metric and the British system without realizing it. So the numbers, they would use the same numbers, but they would mean different things in units. So this is a real story, and that could have, in other contexts, serious implications that could threaten our life and safety. So the point is, what are we to make of this? How do we advance so that the knowledge production systems that we're looking at can be better servants of our needs? We have, of course, the traditional modes, basic, applied, and experimental, basic research, applied research, and experimental development. We have now the different ways to work with disciplines. You have the traditional multidisciplinary approach, then the interdisciplinary, trying to be more synthetic, but the transdisciplinary is where you really, in effect, try to define new disciplines and work beyond specific disciplinary boxes. That is not a trivial challenge, because obviously it's tremendous inertia and resistance, understandably, by the disciplinarians, and then also you need to establish your own validity and identity as a transdisciplinarian. That is an open, ongoing struggle, but that is a very significant factor in the reinvention and redefinition of the universities and how to be more effective and efficient. So should a university want to promote this interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, what does that mean, and what are the implications for the governance issues? And now going into innovation. I know we're running out of time, but I would like to have a few more minutes, if I may, Yuzo. Innovation is an uphill battle, and this is what Machiavelli wanted to say here. And that actually also reinforced by this definition. In my definition of innovation is that as a complex, dynamic, socio-technical, socio-economic, and socio-political phenomenon. And so in that sense, it means and represents the fruits of human endeavor. In fact, innovation is the end of a journey that begins with creativity and invention. And through entrepreneurship, the working prototypes coming out of invention, creativity, and invention actually are converted, transformed into working solutions that sell. If we're talking about commercialization, and you see this, the innovation cube here. So entrepreneurship is the bridge helping us achieve successful introduction to the market of a solution that is innovation. And of course, there's also social innovation. There is public and private and hybrid goods that are the products still of creativity and invention, but are commercialized for the benefit of the public at large, or the improvement of quality of life and safety and so forth, not just private profit. Both are desirable and should be pursued. How does that operate in the context of a society and economy, depending a number of factors, including again the quadruple, quintuple, even helix, government, university, industry, civil society, and environment dimensions. Okay, where and how does innovation manifest? And what is the role of the university in this context? Of course, there is the linear model of innovation, and more realistically, in a way, more accurately, we have nonlinear, as I said earlier, dynamic phenomena that represent innovation, where data, information, and knowledge is developed, accumulated, combined, recombined, and leveraged to provide solutions, produce working prototypes, and provide solutions to introduce in the market, coming from a number of sectors, university laboratories, university spin-off companies. We'll talk about the entrepreneurial university and the academic firm in a moment, and of course, government labs and so forth. So you have a combination of innovation modes that are nonlinear, and that relates also to the way knowledge is perceived and the knowledge production processes are perceived. And there is some analogy between that and the higher order learning I discussed earlier. So we have mode 1 and mode 2 knowledge production systems that Gibbons and Novotny and others introduced, and they reflect a level of nonlinearity that we further chose to emphasize and enhance. The mode 3 knowledge production system is the idea that you get to operate and involve the university and everybody else in the quadruple and quintuple innovation helix context, in a manner that actually is driven by higher order learning, and it is in that sense, if allowed, as effective and efficient as possible. So the mode 3 university that actually is also, as we will see next, very modular and flexible in its structure, is in essence the culmination, the apex of high efficacy, as we titled our presentation earlier. So just a brief reference to the triple, quadruple helix, and then all of them put together for reference. That is in many publications and so forth. And the focus, of course, is civil society and then the environment. For the quintuple helix, you want to do things that actually serve the society and also are supportive of and protective of the environment, of course. Academia is shown here by design, intentionally, to be at the core, at the heart of the quintuple helix. interacting and building and supporting as a knowledge engine, industry, government, and of course, society and the environment. Now, we have the digital transformation process. We need to go beyond that to be technocentric, but also human-centric. The European Commission in January of 21, among others, I have been writing with others about this for some time now. We need to advance the paradigm to go into a level where we have, yes, we have technology, but digitalization doesn't end up filtering out our identities as humans or suppress it or in some ways violate it. So then we need also to be mindful of societies, often aging societies. And this is Paradigm Society 5.0, in fact, came out of Japan primarily, and now it's also along with Industry 5.0 primary frames and standards of reference in that regard for digital transformation and development of digital solutions, including digital transformation in education. And this is what we mean with Universities 5.0. This is aligning and leveraging and building on the Industry 5.0 and Society 5.0 examples. So we have digital, institutional, and cultural transformation that needs to take place continually, by the way. This is not a one-off, even if we knew the perfect recipe. This is a Zen exercise, as I mentioned, and the idea is that we develop this, we enact this transformation in a manner I will show in the next slides how that, so that the leaders become more servant, the servant leadership style, and the stakeholders more empowered. They need to be more engaged and involved and responsible in this regard. Now, historically, we had, of course, the ancient academies, including the Hellenic academies, and then, of course, there's a movement towards increasingly new forms of university organizing and governance that highlight and emphasize academic entrepreneurship, but also the nature and the scale and scope and impact of the third mission, the outreach, and moving beyond the narrowly defined internal, inwardly defined operations and charter of a university. So an entrepreneurial university is really focusing on the third mission, but in a manner, as I said before, and we'll see it next, that is also emphasizing the production and upgrading of hybrid goods with the public and the private aspect. And so the university being at the heart of the quintuple helix architecture that I showed earlier can play a very important role in this process. And ironically, in some ways, unfortunately, they lag behind instead of being the leaders and the pioneers of transformation for societies and economies. This is an open challenge and opportunity. And let me specifically refer to what I mean here. Let me go forward because there's too much here. That I've already touched on in a way. The point I want to mention is that along with the civic universities you see here is the fractal research education innovation ecosystem. This is something that I proposed some time ago back in 2011, but this is becoming, in my mind, increasingly, it appears to be coming to the fore now. And this is about figuring out how to organize, as far as Europe goes now in the European context, a continent-wide ecosystem of research, education, and innovation centers. So this would be flexible. So university could be re-envisioned in a way. And of course, that takes a gradual transformation. I'm not talking about some kind of revolution here. A flexible, open learning, open knowledge, and open innovation ecosystem with centers that would be transdisciplinary, research, education, innovation centers. They would, by fiat, by mandate and design, reach across disciplines and have a sort of what I would call a multi-legged T approach in their charter and operational architecture, meaning they would have multiple areas of expertise in depth, but they would also have the capacity to synthesize. The fact is that nowadays in Europe, we're talking about, and in other places, there's a discussion about the need for multiple PhDs, multiple terminal degrees that actually need to become more competent in more complementary and more comprehensive in addressing the needs of today and also especially of tomorrow. This is going back to the learning how to learn and learning to learn how to learn the capabilities. This is meant to be organized in a fractal, as you see here, meaning self-similar and self-organizing via higher order learning processes approach that would be local and global in nature. And it would really have as its mission, maybe we could call this the fourth mission now. It would not be just about outreach. It would be about strategic integration across multiple domains, disciplines, and levels. And moreover, the vision here is that this outreach now will not be just publication or informal or formal, peer-to-peer communities of interest and practice, network development, but it will be more substantive and substantial. I call this innovation diplomacy. I've done some work and publications on this field to complement and relate to cultural diplomacy, science diplomacy, and so forth. Well, this is, in fact, we have a recent handbook, if I may refer to two forthcoming works we have with Edward Elgar. One is on handbook on artificial intelligence, entrepreneurship, and innovation. If people are interested, I'll be happy to provide information. The other is actually a handbook on cyber defense, development, democracy, and diplomacy. Cyber D4, if you wish. So Fraunhofer, the Fraunhofer Research Network in Germany may be one point of reference, but of course needs to be substantially advanced, enhanced, and modified. And I do have a collaborative relationship with them. But the idea is to be an ecosystem that is continually evolving and transforming, okay? And it would be EU-wide, aiming to support and enhance and enable the mid-range, especially universities, that are not able to do this bridging effect. They're not able to have their own innovation diplomacy, so to speak. So there are a lot of, since 2011, when I first started proposing this, there have been a lot of measures and institutions developed by the EU to actually promote this and to some extent mirror what's already in the US. But I think this actually could be better advanced and move from tactical fragmentation to strategic integration. Ironically, we often have these sort of institutional innovations taking place at different centers and different institutions appearing and actually operating to facilitate or to advance, to trigger more fragmentation, because they each try to create their own space, their own turf, and their own influence. And this should not be, this is the wrong mindset in my mind. So in conclusion now, and thank you for your patience, coexistence, coevolution, and co-learning is the way to go, and it should inspire both academics and people in the other sectors to engage and operate following these keywords: mode 3, quadruple, and quintuple helix. A democracy of knowledge is important because we optimize and maximize, and Eric von Hippel at MIT wrote about the democratization of innovation some time ago. It's important, especially in an age of complexity, risk, and uncertainty, and multiple threats, that the citizens become increasingly informed, enabled, and engaged. And so in closing, this is a map of, or an architecture of what Mode 3 is about: pluralism and diversity, encouragement of transdisciplinarity, building, of course, on Mode 1 and 2, knowledge production systems again, and leveraging the quintuple helix, all aspects of the helical architecture, and of course, different technologies, including AI. Now, this may promote and allow new forms of employment. Doesn't mean, should not mean inferior in terms of workers' rights or the social contract and what have you. And we see that, unfortunately, in many ways being threatened and challenged nowadays. We also need to look at, as far as academia is concerned, remember I mentioned the multi-legged T approach. We need both vertical and horizontal integration. Tenure should not be abolished without really having serious and credible alternatives, but it should be and could be transformed to accommodate higher degrees of transdisciplinarity, to acknowledge the fact that people may actually not be only narrowly focused on a very specific area, and in fact, to both recognize and reward that. Unfortunately, nowadays, we have, to some extent, the opposite trend and effect. And that, again, I understand the need for expertise in depth and specialization in depth, but this is no longer enough. And we should certainly not suppress creativity, in my mind, by focusing only on that and empowering only specialization. This is ironically actually undermining seriously effectiveness. It may appear to be enhancing the efficacy, the efficiency rather frontier, but it seriously undermines the effectiveness frontier. So overall, the efficacy suffers. This is something we need to be very much aware of. So cross-employment, we have that to some extent today. Going forward, and also in the context of virtualization, we need to really consider developing new modes and new standards for this, to allow for fully virtual options if people want that, as long as the technology can support that, and to allow and promote, in that sense, the engagement of more stakeholders in more creative ways in the ecosystem, in the fractal research, education, innovation ecosystem that I mentioned. So, for instance, as a specific example, we could and should perhaps figure out how to allow for special full-time equivalent positions for professors in Finland that may be located in Southern Europe and so forth. We already have the digital nomads. And, just to, how should I say, to reassure my friends in Finland and the other Scandinavian countries, the planet is warming up as it is anyway. So pretty soon, I'm afraid, actually, it will be rather pleasant to be in Scandinavia anyway, more pleasant perhaps than the Southern Europe turning into a desert. So don't worry about having everybody move to the south. But pursue the opportunity to engage more people more creatively and constructively. So in closing, what are implications for strategy, policy, and governance? These are just some questions I leave for you to think about. What are the implications for universities, higher education institutions, in particular, in their quest to become Mode 3 universities, and also, of course, entrepreneurial universities pursuing the fourth mission, as I said? What are the implications for basic research, cross-employment, and nonlinear innovation, where we have, sort of a self-similarity of fractals? And also, in closing, innovation ecosystems. What about their nature, dynamics, and role? Innovation entrepreneurship ecosystems that can be the enabling devices for the FRIA universities, the fractal research, education, and innovation universities, connecting them with the government, industry, and civil society stakeholders. and some ending thoughts about systems and philosophers and kings that I think are very pertinent nowadays, even more than ever. That kings need to have a philosophical sensitivity, understanding, and awareness. Otherwise, we're all going to be in more difficult days, okay? And that we all need to be aware of the fact that systems thinking approach is what we really is the defining factor in the pursuit of truth. And so to also recognize and thank part of my host today, I will try to say sheshe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elias, for the fantastic lecture, which is very theoretical heavy. I think it's very important you give the lecture, as you often said, thinking beyond the box. I think this lecture is a perfect example of thinking beyond the box. You have offered very valuable outside-in perspective. I see the outside-in perspective in 2 dimensions. So one is a perfect and also comprehensive portrait of the surroundings of higher education. So we are as higher education researchers, we are mainly looking at what is within the box, within higher education, but you have bring in the innovation system, especially the ecosystem, quadruple and quintuple helix model. So that's perfect, for the outside of higher education. So on the second dimension, you also bring in very useful management perspective, some approaches which have been long time applied in business world, but less used in higher education. For example, your concept about the high order learning, the triple loops of action learning, I think is also very important to be applied in governance or management in higher education. So you have perfectly, showing how we should think beyond the box and how thinking beyond the box may benefit higher education organization and management. So I really appreciate, you offer such a lecture, which is very, very unique, but also, it's likely, we are moving from interdisciplinarity to transdisciplinarity, like you have portrayed. I just want to invite our audience. So let me take a look. So probably we haven't got any questions yet on the chat box. So now I open the floor. So even though we have only 5 minutes, about 5 to 6 minutes, so I do hope you can read some. Okay, yeah. So Finn, you have asked a question. Oh no, it's more like comments. So for example, it's more useful for understanding the education or university 5.0. Oh, would you like to say something or comment, ask a question, Professor Finn? Oh, okay.
You're asking me or? Sorry.
No, ask Finn from Vietnam.
Questions are very welcome. I am sorry if I left people speechless. What are the conditions for creating FRIET? Yes.
Okay, I think Paul has a question.
Yes.
Yeah, would you like to say by yourself, Professor Yang?
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Karayanis, for this insightful presentation. It's quite a lot. I mean, I have to say it's a lot of discussion from a very wide areas. My particular question is, I'm very interested in this free system, the fractal research education and innovation ecosystem you mentioned earlier in your presentation. I was just wondering what kind of policies, especially innovation or research policy and higher education policies are necessary for creating such a system, especially I think your prior recommendation was in the European setting. So what can you see for non-European settings? What are your recommendations? Thank you very much.
Yeah, clearly there are contingencies and constraints and conditions, initial conditions, so to speak, that that in a way define the feasibility of options we may identify to approach or proceed in terms of policies and practices. More specifically, there are different degrees of freedom, literally and figuratively, in different parts of the world regarding universities in particular. And of course, as I said, even where there appears to be more flexibility and more degrees of freedom, there's always a tug of war, power play between the central government and the universities, because, as I said, academics have a lot more power than they realize. And of course, they're not at all sophisticated in wielding it in an elegant enough manner to be effective and efficient without being disruptive. And what that all means specifically is that you need to optimize or maximize in a way the fit with the conditions in the ground and the transformative policies you would undertake. In all cases, you need to have a bottom-up pilot, modular incremental approach. This is something that is urgent, but in reality and in life, most things that are urgent cannot be rushed. You need to be what I call a patient innovation gardener in pursuing this type of transformation and institutional innovation. You need to, first of all, identify, map the conditions and the challenges. You need to take stock, that is, of what the resources and constraints and challenges are, what the stakeholders are, and what their mindset is. You need to understand, therefore, and this is also in a game theoretic sense, how to identify and configure win-win-win. Remember, I mentioned the Nash equilibrium concept earlier, win-win-win configurations, and propose, therefore, transformations for or reforms in terms of policy, educational policy and practice that would be more likely than not supported by most stakeholders, gain critical mass of support to move forward. I think there are priorities in most countries, whether in Europe or in Asia, that actually, in many ways, are not that different. This is about sustainable and resilient prosperity. The universities are knowledge banks, both human and intellectual capital. I don't like using that word concerning people and knowledge and ideas, but there are assets and resources, in effect, that the people in the universities and their knowledge, know-how, experience, expertise, research, and interactions represent and continually create. That, these are, in that sense, knowledge banks, repositories of very valuable assets that need to be much better understood, much better stock taken of them, much better evaluated to understand their potential, and then much better leveraged. And it's not just about monetization in the narrow profit making sense. It's about, as I said earlier, leverage to produce both public and private goods that are adding value over the long term, and in a sustainable triple top line and triple bottom line manner, meaning triple top line, ethical, effective, and efficient, triple bottom line, financially, socially, and environmentally sustainable. There are serious challenges regarding the environment, and also regarding the peaceful coexistence of countries nowadays. And the two, ironically, have serious negative interactions and implications. A lot, progress towards becoming greener and more environmentally friendly has actually suffered greatly by the war in Europe. And so the question is, how can we all make a positive difference? How can we set the stage and the pathway towards more sustainable and more also resilient prosperity? What that means, in my mind, is, for instance, let me talk about, since you are in China and you're asking me in effect about China, clearly China needs to take care of its own house first, develop its own indigenous capabilities, but also, and the Belt and Road Initiative is one way that could be useful in that regard, is to integrate in a constructive and peaceful way with the rest of the world. And in that sense, China, of course, is a very important country, but it does not exist in a vacuum. And it exists on the same planet as everybody else. We need to make sure the planet becomes more sustainable. And this is a tremendous area of challenge and opportunity for the next 50 years, I would say, not just for academia, but also for, again, industry, government, and everybody else. So to me, this is where we should figure out how to become as effective and efficient, bypassing if needed, abolishing if possible, and in the end, transforming the roadblocks to progress that exist because of traditional mindsets, cultures, and structures in academic contexts. I hope I answered for now in the brief time available. I'm happy to further discuss.
Thank you very much. You fully addressed my question. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for the answers and also for today's lecture, Professor Elias Karayiannis. So wonderful talk. And also I think the audience benefit a lot because you talk, longer time than usually we have. So we have basically 3 minutes over the schedule, but I think, people have been enjoying your lecture like what I'm doing. So this is a wonderful lecture, as I said, just to connect higher education and also, the society, which is basically changing dramatically. I think Elias has perfectly touched upon the essential issues in the changing landscape of our society. Would you like to have a final word to say, Elias?
May I add one last thing? Yes. I mean, given our circumstances, and I don't mean to sound too smart here, but I really think lack of wisdom is a luxury we can not afford anymore, given where we are and where we're headed. And in that sense, this is not just about an academic discussion or exercise. Academia really is and should be at the heart of change and sustainable and resilient progress. So I hope what we discussed is relevant. I hope it inspired people. And also, given my propensity to loquaciousness, to being, to saying a lot of things or having hopefully a lot of good things to say, running over by only 5 minutes is a tremendous achievement. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elias. Thank you everybody for participating in today's lectures, especially for those from China. I know it's still a holiday time, so you spend the time with us, so I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone. I hope I see you next time. We have our next lecture soon after around 2 weeks. So Yulia has posted the information. So bye-bye everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.